From May 20 to June 1, 1941, Operation Mercury took place, the airborne battle to capture Crete. This Greek island in the Mediterranean had been occupied by Great Britain when the Italian army had attacked Greece on the 28th October 1940. Since the Royal Navy could threaten the southeastern flank of the Axis from there, just as they had planned, and the Allied air forces could also bomb the oil fields of Ploiesti in Romania, which they did starting on the 6th, June 1942. However, when the Italian troops starting from the 14th, November 1940 had been pushed back by the Greek-British forces, the Wehrmacht, shown in red, launched Operation Merida on the 6th April 1941. They captured the Greek territory, which was then divided among the three Axis powers, Germany in red, Italy in blue, and Bulgaria in green. As a result, by the end of the month, Allied units numbering 57,000 men were evacuated by the Royal Navy. 18,047 of them were transferred to Crete. In order to withdraw the forces already shown there in red, the German intelligence service under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, based in the Berlin-Bendler bloc, had predicted only 5,000 British soldiers on Crete and no Greek forces, and firmly assumed that the Cretan population would welcome the Germans as liberators due to their strong Republican and anti-monarchist sentiments, which is why only the following forces were available to the defenders at the time of the German attack on Crete. 18,047 British, up to 11,451 Greeks, 7,702, New Zealanders and 6,540, Australians making a total of 42,650 men for the island, which is 254 kilometers long and 60 kilometers wide. Another advantage was the mainly rugged and mountainous landscape of Crete, with the Ida Mountains, a mountain range stretching from west to east, with 30 peaks over 2,000 meters. Such difficult terrain makes movement especially hard for any attacker, especially since the British intelligence service had managed to predict the German strength and the expected start of the attack with relative accuracy, which was because under the codename Ultra, starting in January 1940, they managed to read the messages, first those of the Luftwaffe, and later also those of the Kriegsmarine and the Army, more or less continuously with the Enigma I throughout the entire Second World War. In 1943, for example, more than 80,000 terms per month were intercepted and deciphered by the Allies, which means on average of more than 2,500 every day, and during the war, it was over 2.5 million. It is undisputed that the breaking of the Enigma codes by the Allies was of enormous strategic importance for the course of the Second World War, especially since a good part of what was passed on to Moscow by the British secret agent John Cairncroft later also concerned the Western nuclear weapons program. However, he was not punished. Instead, he was able to spend his later years with a good bottle of de Varouge in southern France. In the case of the expected German attack on Crete, British intelligence knew, through deciphered German radio messages, the estimated strength of the units planned by the Wehrmacht. They determined a force of 25,000 to 30,000 airborne soldiers with 600 aircraft and another 10,000 soldiers who were to be brought in by sea. The predicted day of attack was May 19th, when on the 20th, the German attack actually began. There were 15,750 paratroopers and mountain troops landed by air through 520 aircrafts. With all this timely knowledge about the enemy, combined with sufficient time to prepare, one actually would have assumed that the German attack, which came initially from the air and had many tactical weaknesses in the early phase, could have been easily repelled, especially since the Allied ground forces were clearly superior in numbers. the civilian Greek population of Crete must have assumed that as well. Because when the German paratroopers were still in the air, numerous Cretan civilians had joined the defenders' fight with all the weapons they had at their disposal at the time. The weapons of the Cretans at first were whatever they had available in their kitchens and barns: knives, daggers, scythes, flails, pitchforks, and shotguns. Later, they also fought with captured German weapons. The result: several Germans were wounded in olive groves. German paratroopers had been stabbed or beaten to death, and an older Cretan had practically beaten a paratrooper who was caught in his parachute to death with his walking stick. In the English Wikipedia about Operation Mercury, you can read that mobs of armed civilians had joined the Greek flanking attacks coming from the west at the height of Castelli and Palacora, and their British and New Zealand military advisors had great difficulty preventing larger massacres of Germans. However, scattered or wounded German paratroopers had repeatedly been mistreated by Cretans fighting in civilian clothing. Since the German soldiers had been informed before their costly deployment of the intelligence assessment that the Cretans would welcome them happily, they were both greatly surprised and angered by the civilians who did not wear uniforms, but were armed, fought against them, and did not adhere to any rules of war. As a result, these individuals, as so-called unlawful combatants, did not have the privileges of international law of war, since they had participated in hostilities without combatant status. The result was that the young German soldiers involved in heavy fighting, of whom 1,915 were killed, another 1,759 were missing, and over 2,000 were wounded in the Battle of Crete. Especially after finding dead but mutilated comrades, they felt free from any restraints, to which they would have been complied to by the Hague Convention, which meant when capturing armed Cretan civilians, they often showed no mercy over justice. While no executions of British or Greek soldiers by German soldiers have become known, such incidents did occur later during the direct occupation of Crete by German troops. There had been several so-called atonement or reprisal actions, as they were called at the time, whose nature was later described as war crimes during the post-war trials against German army leaders. For example, on the 2nd, June in the village of Condamari, where residents had participated in the Allied defense against advancing paratroopers using knives, axes, and scythes. As more and more rumors circulated about torture, mutilation, or murder of German soldiers, at least 23 Cretans were shot in Condamari. One day later, on the 3rd of June 1941, 180 residents of the subsequently destroyed village of Kandanos were shot after having participated in fighting for 2 days against the 5th Mountain Division under Major General Julius Ringel, the Kratzschützen Battalion 55, which was subordinated under Major Schaka. During this, an entire platoon and a half platoon of engineers were killed. Memorial plaques in the village commemorate the events. Of these and other punitive measures, as well as the deportation of Greek Jews, both the commander of Battle Group East in Crete in 1941, General of the Air Force Bruno Breuer, and his successor, General of the Infantry Friedrich Wilhelm Müller, were being handed over by the British and afterward being sentenced to death by a Greek court. They had been executed exactly 6 years after the start of Operation Mercury, on May 20-20, 1947. And what about the person who planned it? And with the commanding general of the 11th Air Corps, Kurt Student, who was also the supreme commander of the airborne battle for Crete. The Austrian Colonel General Alexander was also prosecuted, which was because of the bombardment of the city Elgrad, which had previously been declared an open city, and where around 2,200 people had been killed. The Yugoslav court executed him on the 26th February 1947 by shooting. Belgrade was later attacked by Allied bomber groups a total of 11 times over a period of 4 months and 3 weeks, with 43 German and 96 Italian soldiers killed, but also between 2,271 and 4,000 civilians. Another 6 extradited and sentenced to death by hanging for war crimes were Brigade Führer August Schmidhuber, who was most recently the commander of the 7th Division, which was formed from ethnic Germans in the northern Serbian Banat, the SS Volunteer Mountain Divisions. Prince Eugen, Lieutenant General Johann Fortner, who was commander of the 718th Infantry Division, deployed in the Balkans until mid-March, as well as his successor as division commander until March 44, Lieutenant General Joseph Kubler, Lieutenant General Fritz Neidholt until October 44, commander of the 369th Infantry Division, which was mainly composed of Croatian volunteers. The Austrian Major General Adalbert Longse, 1943 commander of Belgrade, and Colonel Günther Liebekede, commander of Jaeger Regiment 150 in 1944, which was mainly deployed in Yugoslavia as part of the 118th Legion. While a whole series of German generals had to answer in court for the orders they gave during the war, numerous war criminals in the Italian army were not really prosecuted. So, in the early morning of February 16, 1943, 9 Italian soldiers of the 24th Infantry Division Pinerolo and Major General Cesare Benelli were shot by Greek partisans in an ambush near the mainland village of Domenico. After that, soldiers of the Pinerolo Division rounded up the male population between the ages of 14 and 80 in the village square, shot 140 people, and destroyed their houses. It was strange later that the 24th Division, after the Italian capitulation in 1943, did not surrender to the outnumbered Germans like most other Italian divisions did. For the historian Lydia Santarelli, the Domenico massacre was the first in a series of repressive measures that were carried out in the spring and summer of 1943 on the orders of General Carlo Gelosi, the commander of the Italian occupation troops. It was believed that entire villages had to be wiped out in order to crush the Greek partisan movement. In total, up to 11,000 Greek civilians are said to have been executed by the Italians. However, after the war, when Greece and what was by then Tito's communist Yugoslavia, where countless crimes had also been committed between 1943 and 1950, tried to prevent this, the Allied victors, namely Great Britain, opposed this request. Instead, they had chosen Pietro Badoglio, who, after Mussolini was deposed on the 26th, July 1943, had been appointed Italian Prime Minister as the first important representative for an anti-communist post-war Italy. Italy had, on September 3, 1943, with the signature of Brigadier General Giuseppe Castellano, switched to the side of the Allies, and on the 8th, October declared war on Germany. And Badoglio's new government had pledged its loyalty to the Germans still fighting in northern Italy in July, but had already engaged in secret talks with the Allies since the 3rd August 1943. Back to May 1941. After the fighting ended, the Wehrmacht had occupied the 3 western prefectures of the island, Chania, where the headquarters was also located, Heraklion, and Rethymno. The Italians were stationed in the easternmost prefecture of Lassithi until their surrender in September 1943. The first occupation force stationed on Crete was the 5th German Mountain Division. It was the last after major reorganizations and relocations. It also included the 22nd Infantry Division, which until 1944, in the 133rd Fortress Division, and the remaining Crete troops, which were consolidated under Major General Hans-Georg Bentrach. In the area shown in red, which was controlled by the Italians, were the 51st, the 51st Infantry Special Brigade and the 51st Infantry Division Siena. But when the Italian armistice with the Allies came into effect on September 8, 1943, after which both Italian units were disarmed and taken prisoner by the Wehrmacht, the commander of the 21,700-strong Italian division, Lieutenant General Angelico Carda, made contact with Special Operations Executive Major Patrick Lee Fermor through his staff officer responsible for enemy reconnaissance. There will be much more to say about this major and the Special Operations Executive Organization. Then Carda brought with him, as a gift, the German defense plans for the eastern part of the island to Zulzuro. He took a British stronghold, Motor, and arrived on the 23rd of September 1943 at the small port of Marsa Matruh in Egypt, which had been in British hands since the surrender of the German Africa Corps. The defection of Italy from its allies did not end so smoothly. For some of the soldiers of the Crete garrison, who were now in German captivity, things were different. Thus, on the 18th of October 1943, between 1,857 and 5,000 Italian prisoners of war. The numbers vary, but they lost their lives when the motor ship Sinfra, which was supposed to transport them to the Greek mainland, was attacked and sunk by 10 North American B-25 Mitchell bombers of the United States Air Force and Bristol Beaufighter aircraft of the Royal Air Force. And when the ship, which was carrying 3,173 Italians, was sunk by Petrella, by the British submarine, His Majesty's Ship Sportsman. On February 8, 1944, even though the Petrella was clearly marked as a prisoner of war ship with side hull identification, 2,670 Italian prisoners of war from the Crete garrison drowned. It was reported that in both cases, the German guards prevented the lower decks from being opened, threw hand grenades inside, and later shot Italians who were swimming in the water. I just mentioned the term Special Operations Executive in connection with Lieutenant General Scatta, who had escaped. Special Operations Executive stood for Special Operations Executive, a British commando unit that was established in mid-July 1940 by order of Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Special Operations Executive served the purpose of subversive warfare without direct military engagement, and was tasked with carrying out sabotage operations behind enemy lines, as well as supporting local resistance groups in every possible way in the countries occupied by the Germans. The main areas of operation for Special Operations Executive agents in Europe were, as here, France and Yugoslavia, but also Norway. There, in February 1943, an attack was carried out on the heavy water plant in Ryukan, and in Prague, the assassination took place in 1942 on the head of the Reich Main Security Office, Reinhard Heydrich. The inhabitants of the central Bohemian village of Litis had to pay for that. On June 9th, all 176 male residents over the age of 15 were first shot by German police units. Afterwards, the village was leveled. A total of 470 Special Operations Executive agents were smuggled into areas occupied by the Wehrmacht, mostly transported by air with nighttime landings using single-engine aircraft of the Westland Lysander type. For some areas occupied by the Wehrmacht, there were even special departments, and from 1941, there was also one for the region of Crete. One Special Operations Executive agent deployed on Crete was Lieutenant Alexander Fielding, shown here with a group of Cretan partisans in the White Mountains. He had already proposed in 1942 that a high-ranking German officer should be kidnapped, preferably the commander of Fortress Crete, General der Flieger Alexander André. He gave 3 reasons for this. 1. To strengthen the determination and fighting spirit of the Cretan resistance forces. 2. Proof that even a heavily guarded German general was no longer safe. 3. To increase Allied prestige among the Cretans. But then General André was replaced in August 1942 and temporarily succeeded by Major General Bruno Breuer. Then in 1943, the Special Operations Executive members, Captain William Stanley Moss and Major Patrick Lee Fermor, presented a plan to kidnap the then commander of the 22nd. Airborne Divisio, the general of the infantry, Friedrich Wilhelm Müller, who was already mentioned in connection with the executions that took place in Greece in 1947. The plan was to kidnap him and bring him to Egypt in order to give the occupied Cretans a moral boost, as Lee Fermor explained. However, the senior executive of the Special Operations Committee, Lieutenant Colonel Bickham Sweet Escott, was strongly opposed to it. His reasoning was that a kidnapped general would be immediately replaced, and that the uncertain boost to the morale of the Cretans would not outweigh the reprisals from the Germans that could be expected after the kidnapping. Nevertheless, the commander of the Special Operations Executive in the Middle East, Colonel Karl Wilbacher Benfield, approved the plan in September 1943, after which the operation was launched. By late 1943, the time had come. Major Lee Fermor and Captain Moss had made contact with 2 members of the Cretan resistance movement who were to assist them in their abduction of General Müller. After training at a Special Operations Executive Camp at the Royal Air Force Base Ramadav in Palestine, now an Israeli military airfield, the team was on the 4th. January 1944, flown to the headquarters of the British 8th Army in the Italian port city of Bari. To the city that, on the 2nd, December 1943, had been bombed by 105 German bombers, U-88. In the process, 28 transport ships not. 18, as Wikipedia states, were destroyed, including those of the Liberty class. John Harvey, which was carrying a cargo of 2,000 AN-M47 bombs, filled with a total of 480 tons of mustard gas, exploded. 1,000 soldiers and civilians were killed. In February 1944, the Americans confirmed the toxic cargo and even agreed to its publication. However, Winston Churchill had ordered all British documents about it to be deleted. Instead, the mustard gas deaths were declared as burns caused by enemy action. In 1947, during the salvage of the sunken ships, it was then discovered that other ships had also been carrying poison gas. Among them were chlorosulfonic acid for the production of smoke acid, chloropicrin, also known as base gas, Green Cross, as well as the blood agent chlorocein. Great Britain only admitted to the whole matter in 1986, after 42 years. On February 4th, the team arrived in Brindisi, from where they continued with a Royal Air Force bomber to be dropped by parachute over the 1,115-meter-high Catharo Plateau in Crete. However, a dense cloud cover above had prevented that. But while the other 3 members of the group were flown back to Cairo, Lee Fermor had himself dropped off, where, third from the left, he met Cretan partisans and Special Operations Executive Captain Sandy Randall. But when the group arrived at their hideout in a cave above the village of Tarpais in the Lassiti Mountains, they learned that the injured General Müller, as commander of the 22nd Infantry Division, was replaced by Major General Heinrich Greipe on February 15. Lee Fermor had on the 30th. March reported the change of command to the Special Operations Executive Section, responsible for Crete in Cairo, but at the same time insisted on carrying out the abduction of General Greipe under any circumstances. But he was still alone. since the rest of the team under Major Moss would not arrive until they were able to be brought to Zusura by motorboat on April 4th. Now they could begin the abduction of General Greipe. Their intended victim was Heinrich Greipe, who was born on June 5, 1895 in Niederspeer, in what is now the Kiefhäuser district. After his service on the Eastern Front during the 900-day siege of Leningrad, he was promoted to colonel and awarded the Knight's Cross in October 1941. Later, Greipe was the commander of the 79th, which was deployed in the Battle of Kharkov, as well as in Stalingrad in the 79th. Infantry Division. In September 1943, he was promoted to Major General, and on the 15th, February 1944, he became the commander of the 22nd Infantry Division, which was stationed in Crete. His superiors called Greipe strong, energetic, and firm in character. Employees of the secret British prisoner interrogation service combined the service's detailed interrogation. Center saw him more as an insignificant and unimaginative opponent of the Nazi regime with a weak character. His abduction was scheduled for the evening of the 26th April. Major Lee Fermor and Captain Moss were supported by 3 Cretans and a Michael Akumianakis, whose house was located opposite the official residence of Kreipe, shown in green in the village of Knossos. At the Villa Ariadne, Akumianakis had also obtained a signaling paddle for Lee, Fermor, and Moss, as well as 2 German summer uniforms, one for a staff corporal, the other with a corporal's stripe. An attack on the stadium, which was well secured with barbed wire, and the staff headquarters in Achanes had been ruled out. Therefore, the British had decided to abduct the general in this area during one of his trips to his quarters or to the staff building. During their reconnaissance, disguised as Greek farm workers, Lee Fermor is on the right. They had identified the junction where the road from Achanes meets the main road to Heraklion, where vehicles had to slow down almost to a stop. Here is the current situation. To better conceal everything, the operation was to be carried out at night. Then, a message from the local leader of the Communist Greek Liberation Army, or GLA for short, caused some confusion, because in it, he had threatened to report them to the authorities if they did not leave his area of interest. Lee Fermor responded with an ambiguously worded note, after which the Greek Liberation Army man refrained from reporting them. But then, on the 26th April 1944, with Lee Fermor and Moss disguised as German corporals, the story began. A story that, however, also contains some inconsistencies. On this Wednesday evening, General Greipe was being chauffeured by his driver, the Hamburg-born 30-year-old Corporal Albert Felska, in his service car. This Opel Capitan was leaving the Green Mark Divisional Staff Quarters in Archanes, heading to his villa in Yellow, a little more than 8 kilometers away. Both they were only armed with their pistols, and machine gun was lying on the back seat. Why Greipe had dispensed with the motorcycle escort that usually accompanied him this time is not known, as their vehicle approached the intersection. While the disguised Lee Fermor and Moss were hiding, the agreed-upon light signal came from the group of 11 Cretan partisans nearby at around 9:30 p.m. "Attention, General is coming. There is no escort." When Greipe's Opel Capitan almost came to a stop at the intersection, the 2 Britons disguised as German soldiers, as shown in this reenacted picture, jumped onto the road and stopped the car. Now I will describe the account of the events as given by Lee Fermor. If they had demanded both the soldier's paybook and the travel order in German, and then when the general reached into his pocket, they drew their pistols. They dragged Greipe, who was resisting with his fists, out of the car, identified themselves as British officers, and declared him and his subordinate Felska as their prisoners of war. This photo is from the 1957 film. However, one must also ask why General Greipe and the subordinate were traveling at night without the usual escort and fell for this strange checkpoint without becoming suspicious. especially since those guys in uniform on the left, Lee Fermor, and on the right, Moss, must have had a weird English accent. And this seemingly military police squad was without submachine guns, gorgets, and did wear field caps instead of steel helmets, while asking for the soldiers' identification and travel orders in complete darkness. Because real field gendarmerie, for example from the paratroopers, always looked like this in action, and besides, it was definitely pitch dark out in the middle of nowhere. In addition, the general blackout regulations also applied in Crete. Everything is confusing and only reported through the two publications by the British protagonists, which have always been used as the main sources since then. Greipe himself never commented on the results in Crete, for whatever reason. But in 1972, as seen on the right in the picture, he met with Major Lee Fermor once again. And you can admire his Opel Capitan in Crete, all tough with Kreipe's name spelled incorrectly, which was spelled with N-E, not an A. The date on the plate is also being 1 year too early. In any case, the other Greek team members had now arrived and surrounded the Opel. In a brief struggle, according to Fermor, he knocked out Unterbezieher Felska with this blackjack. While part of the group erased the traces and the general, who was handcuffed, was brought back to the car, Moss, with Lee Fermor posing as General Kreipe, drove the Opel from the crime scene marked in green toward Heraklion, with 3 Cretans in the back seat. Then, after a few more minutes, Moss and the general got out at the red spot, while Lee Fermor continued driving the car westward. The people erasing the traces also drove toward Heraklion in another vehicle. Unterbezieher Felski was among them, without getting ahead of himself, either immediately after days or weeks. Who can say for sure today? Unterbezieher Felska was murdered by Greek partisans with stab wounds. His body was not found until years later. He now rests with the German soldiers who remained on Crete at the Malam War Cemetery. On their way to Heraklion, the team is said to have passed through 22 German checkpoints without stopping, driving at high speed. This would have been possible because Greipe had always been impatient during previous road checks, so no soldier at the checkpoints dared to stop the Opel with the divisional commander's pennant. However, Lee Fermor never revealed how he supposedly knew about the general's impatience during inspections. After several more kilometers, the car was left at Point Green. The group of kidnappers then continued on through Ratimno to Red, and from there marched along a steep mountain path that led to the hamlet of Anogja. In the Opel, they had left a note stating that the operation had been carried out by a British commando unit and without any support from Cretans. They had also left behind English cigarettes and a crime novel by Agatha Christie, which was meant to prove that the kidnapping had been carried out by British soldiers. A few days later, while General Greipe was being searched for, these leaflets were even dropped by British planes to protect the Cretan partisans. The German Wehrmacht office investigating the incident believed the part about the English, but not the claim that there had been no Cretan support. In Anogja, the group of kidnappers had to pause for a few hours, because the 51-year-old general sitting in the middle of the picture, who was not used to physical activity, was finding it increasingly difficult to climb the mountains. The day after the kidnapping, late afternoon on the 27th April, a German Fiesler, Storch dropped leaflets written in critical language, threatening reprisals, in case the general would not be returned within 3 days. Regardless of that, the British Cretan commando had now climbed towards the snow-covered Mount Ida, which is 2,456 meters high, with General Greipe leading the way. There, they met another group of Cretan partisans and had to rest again, because the general was having trouble with his feet. There, they had put Greipe on a mule, but at some point, the saddle girth broke. Greipe had fallen down a steep slope and injured his right arm in the process. Meanwhile, all German units on Crete had been put on high alert, and search parties had been sent out. Through a report monitored by the British Broadcasting Corporation, the Wehrmacht command on Crete had learned that the kidnappers probably had not yet been able to leave the island. Rumors spread about an upcoming Allied invasion and a possible general Cretan uprising. As a result, General Brewer reinforced the troops in Konya and increased the number of checkpoints. Greipe's adjutant and the security guards responsible for his safety had been arrested on suspicion of complicity, but that was all. General Breuer had not ordered any reprisals for the time being, since he assumed that Greipe's abduction had been bloodless, and that both the general and Sergeant Felsky were still alive. As mentioned, the sergeant's body was not found until many years later. Since the radios of the Cretan EOS agents had failed, and all messages from Moss and Lifemore to the EOS headquarters in Cairo had to be relayed through a chain of Cretan EOS agents with working radios, it was understandable that all the messages delivered across the difficult terrain had delayed the team's activities by days. When they then took shelter in Ajapereskavi and another messenger arrived at the abduction team, they sent him back with the request to send a boat to a bay in the south of Sakturia on May 2nd to pick them and the general up there, but the Cretan messenger disappeared. Instead, another one arrived with a radio, and the Special Operations Executive Officer, Captain Richard Barnes. He brought the news that a boat unit of the Special Boat Service, founded in March 43 and led by Major George Jellicoe, would pick them up on the night of the 14th May. From the beach at Rodakino. After another difficult march through the rugged terrain, the group of kidnappers boarded this SPS boat with General Greipe at around 10 p.m., which then took them to British-occupied Egypt. Since the kidnapping, they had been on foot in the mountains for a total of 18 days. The blue dots show their hiding places. On May 25th, General Greipe was first taken via Cairo and London to the officer prisoner of war camp Trent Park, south of London, where he stayed and was interrogated until August 23rd. Then he was transferred to a prisoner of war camp in Canada and released from captivity back to Germany in October 47. In 1957, the events were also adapted into a feature film under the same name, based on the book Ill Met by Moonlight, published by Moss in 1950. And in 2014, 2 years after his death, Lee Fairmore's book Abducting a General, the Kreipe Operation, and Special Operations Executive in Crete was also published. It sometimes reads like an adventure novel by Karl May. Although Major Patrick Lee Fermor was awarded the Distinguished Service Order, and Captain Moss received the Military Cross, and the entire abduction operation was exploited in the media and for propaganda purposes, the mission, including the later ambush at Damasta on the 8th of August, marked by many fallen or killed German soldiers, is still controversial. On the 1st July, General Müller, known for his relentless punitive actions against Cretan partisans, had returned as commander of Fortress Crete. Lieutenant General Helmut Friebe was the commander of the 22nd Infantry Division. Meanwhile, the otherwise harmless Heinrich Greipe, one of 15 children of a Protestant pastor, had little to tell the British interrogation specialists at Trent Park, the officers' prisoner of war camp set up for German and Italian generals and staff officers. But since the kidnappers had spent some time in the village of Anogja during their march to the south coast of Crete, on the 7th August 1944, the base commander from the green-marked Jeligav, Sergeant Joseph Olenhauer, arrived in Anogja in red with a group of soldiers to forcibly recruit men for labor there. However, after they refused to comply with this forced measure, Olenhauer selected around 50 residents to take them as hostages to his base. But when they arrived near the hamlet of Damasta range, partisans attacked Olenhauer's unit, killed all the soldiers, and freed the hostages. Meanwhile, since the beginning of July, Special Operations Executive Captain Moss, who had been sent back by Brigadier General Barker Benfield in Cairo, was back on Crete. There, he coordinated sabotage missions for 41 British boat service commandos, who landed in the night from July 1st to July 2nd. During these operations, which lasted until July 29th, successful attacks were carried out on motor vehicle parks and fuel depots. Around 30 German soldiers were killed during these operations. On July 29th, the 41 commandos left the island again, after on the 7th. August, the deadly ambush for Sergeant Ollenhauer and his soldiers had been set. Moss had on the 8th. August 1944, in a kind of private war, launched an attack with 8 Cretan partisans and 6 escaped Russian prisoners of war near the village of Damasta. He wanted to prevent German units from attacking Anogja. After his group managed to destroy some passing German military vehicles, they attacked a Wehrmacht truck carrying infantrymen and an accompanying armored car. In the process, 35 German and 10 Italian soldiers were killed. But Moss's calculation that he would have saved Anogja with this did not work out, because now General Müller, whom the Cretans called the Butcher, had another reason to respond with so-called reprisals. On the 13th May, an order was issued written in Greek and in broken English, in which H. Müller referred to himself in the third person. And the German Wikipedia translation, the death of Sergeant Ollenhauer and his men is omitted in the order of the German commander of the garrison. Crete, since the city of Anogja is the center of the English intelligence service in Crete, since the residents of Anogja committed the murder of the sergeant and his base Genigave, since the residents of Anogja carried out the Damasta raid. Since in Anogja, the guerrillas from various resistance groups have found refuge and protection, and since the kidnappers of General Greipe used Anogja as a transit camp, we order its complete destruction and the execution of every male person from Anogja who is found within the village and within a radius of 1 kilometer. The commander of the garrison, H. Müller. Then, in the early morning of August 13, 1944, units of the 65th Grenadier Regiment of the 22nd Infantry Division marched into Anogja, where, as part of so-called reprisal measures, they executed between 25 and 30 residents and, after extensive looting, blew up a large number of houses. One of the intelligence officers on the island, Ralph Hadley, Stockbridge, in the center of the picture wearing a service cap, later stated, quote, that the from them completely unwanted attack on the Germans at Damasta by Moss contributed to the destruction of Anogja. Afterwards, when the Cretan partisan groups sensed an opportunity and intensified their attacks on German and Italian occupation troops, countless innocent people died violently as a result of the retaliatory measures that were then carried out, and that the 2 British protagonists described their operation almost like a private war in the brightest colors and like to emphasize their role in it. It doesn't change the fact that the senior executive of the Special Operations Committee, Lieutenant Colonel Bickham's sweet escort, was right when he spoke out against a kidnapping operation that could be used for propaganda purposes, but also said that such an operation, carried out by a few soldiers with hardly any coordination, would have no military benefit in war, but instead could destroy a lot and end bloodily and cruelly for a civilian.